we learnt a lot from the first 18 months, but I think now we've had plenty of time to bring and integrate our strategies and start functioning as one force to fight this battle rather than fighting this battle, through silos. And that's essentially what we have. We have the federal government, we have the state government, we have providers. Still to this day, we're still operating in silos. And to me, it's insane. I totally appreciate that there's, legal ramifications, there's red tape. But if this isn't a time to bring all these groups together and fight the one fire on the one front, I don't know, what is.
Silver Adventures is a content and technology company dedicated to improving the lives of older adults through immersive virtual reality experiences. And this podcast is our opportunity to hear from industry experts, thought leaders, and passionate individuals to share with you their knowledge, expertise, and experiences. Welcome to the Aged Care Enrichment Podcast. Hello there, welcome to the show. I'm your host Ash, or Ashley Deneef if you want to be formal. I hope you're feeling footloose and COVID-free today for another episode, and fancy that, today's conversation is all about the COVID response in Australian aged care. Now, this is a bit of a first for us. We've been interviewing prominent and interesting folk from the aged care industry for the last year and a bit, and we've yet to have a conversation focused entirely on COVID. But the day has come, and helping us take a look at the response so far and the future of COVID and aged care is Chris Mamarelis, CEO of Whiddon. COVID has impacted the industry in so many profound ways, and though we get pretty deep with this conversation, we've still only just scratched the surface. One topic we do focus on a lot, which you may relate to or find interesting, is the confusing and problematic communication throughout the COVID response from the various levels of government. Chris and the Whiddon team have recently released a paper identifying some recurrent problems and proposing some solutions, which you'll hear about in the episode. I should say as well that this interview was recorded in mid-October 2020 when New South Wales and Victoria were emerging from lockdowns, and already COVID facts have changed. They have a tendency to do that, including a mention of booster shots, which has been recently approved nationwide. Before we jump into it, I wanted to say firstly, thanks. Thanks very much for listening. If you're a returning listener, thanks for coming back. And if it's your first time, thanks, welcome, we hope you stick around. Secondly, we wanted to say if there's a guest or topic that you think would be a great fit for our third season, which starts in 2022, shoot us an email through to acepodcast, that's ACE podcast, @silveradventures.com.au. Alrighty, that's enough from me. Here's the interview with Chris Mamarelis. Chris, thanks so much for joining us on the show today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no, we're really happy to have you. Could you maybe give us a quick intro to yourself and your work?
So I'm the CEO at Whiddon Aged Care. We are a large not-for-profit aged care provider. We've been around for almost 75 years now. We have a large footprint in regional Australia, regional New South Wales and Queensland. We also have a large campus in Sydney, probably one of the largest in Australia, with almost 500 residents that we're caring for on site.
Wow.
And we focus on residential aged care, home community care and retirement living. So we offer a span of services there as well. And I think we're pretty proud of the way we deliver our care. We've been innovating our model of care. We've pioneered relationship-based care. We've also been involved in providing expert advice at the Royal Commission on a number of occasions as well. So we're a pretty active member in the aged care community, as well as providing services to a lot of really important communities that we're a part of.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Listeners of the show will know that we haven't really ever focused on COVID. We skirted around the issue. It feels a bit like everywhere you look at in life at the moment, it's COVID all the time. But what would be really helpful, I think, maybe you can take us back to March 2020 and the arrival of COVID, and maybe the first few months of adjusting to that. What was that like in the facilities?
I've got to stretch my mind back because so much has happened since then. When you go back, obviously there was a lot of uncertainty. At that point in time, at the beginning of the pandemic, we didn't know what to expect. And we've seen these things happen before where they brush over and it's more of an overseas thing. But for us, I think as the level of risk started to increase and we started to realise that this is impacting and think that we can't sort of ignore what's going on and that the advice you're getting from government and all of that started to ramp up, I think the first thing you had to do, and remember I'm stretching my memory here, but I think the first thing you had to do was you had to take a bit of a new mindset. So a lot of the things that you were working on, a lot of the bigger plans, the bigger projects, where your resources and your people were focusing, a lot of that just came to a bit of a standstill. We've said we've been in survival mode for the last couple of years, I think, as a sector. I know at Whiddon, we've had to go into this sort of crisis/survival mode, and that's what happened. The team, planning, structures, resources, all of that started to shift into this kind of crisis management, adapting to new protocols, things like getting PPE management to a whole new level to what we were used to, different risk management protocols, team meeting structures, all this huge level of change. And it didn't happen overnight. It started to just creep in. And then I think as we began to understand the virus, the pandemic, as science and medicine was catching up, and then we were being informed about that. So, then vaccination strategies started to appear, and we were really pushing to get all of our residents vaccinated and all that sort of thing. I think it all just started to creep up on us. And I think that with the first wave of COVID, we probably went through, I guess, a 6 to 12 month period. And then that became operationalised. We operationalised that within about 12 months. Yeah. But this was pre-Delta, and we had that pause pre-Delta where I remember even things like board reporting, all of that changed and had this huge focus where you're normally focusing on strategy and a lot of your innovation and your projects and your care plans and a lot of that sort of stuff. It had this focus on the COVID crisis management. And towards the end of that first sort of 8 to 12 months, we started saying, okay, we're now starting to operationalise this. This is becoming BAU. We've got all these screening protocols, PPE, it's all becoming BAU. And we just started to get a sniff of being able to get back in and focus on what is most important, all of our resident and employee-centric projects and all of that. We started to get back into that. And I guess it wasn't long after then this Delta wave hit us, So that's kind of my recollection. As I said, so much water has gone under the bridge in that period, so much that it seems like a millennium ago when all that sort of thing that was going on. But I guess that's my recollection of it.
Yeah. And I think the kind of shifting goalposts throughout it as well, and feeling like, oh, we're coming out, are we going in? What's going to happen? So that lull in between the first wave and the Delta wave, was there kind of an optimism amongst the company that things might start to turn and we can put some of this behind us?
We're very risk averse in aged care. It's all about our residents and employees, and our residents are so vulnerable. We're in a lot of areas where community transmission's been high, particularly in the Sydney metro area. So you started to get a little bit of optimism, but what was a little scary at the time was that the government and the regulators and the people around us just went very quiet on a number of fronts. And I think that, I don't know if they were over-optimistic or what it was, but we started talking about complacency and that we can't be complacent at that point in time. So I think that we were a little bit on edge. We really had to continue that focus on residents and employees. Remember, residents had gone through lockdowns and things like that. So we really wanted to bring people back into our homes, visitations and all of that sort of thing. So yes, there was optimism. However, it was really about reinforcing that we can't be complacent. And I think I was really glad that we took that approach because obviously then the Delta wave came along.
Yeah, and this is all very timely as New South Wales has just had Freedom Day and things are being lifted. I do want to touch back on that in a moment and talk about the future. But beforehand, did Whiddon have any outbreaks in any of their facilities?
Thankfully, touch wood, we had no outbreaks. We've had numerous close calls. We've had residents come back from hospitals who were exposed to COVID positive people, whether they be employees, and we've had to isolate them and we've had to do things like that. But thankfully, we actually haven't had an outbreak in one of our homes. And I will say, in saying that, we had really put a lot of additional protocols. I say that to date, we've been able to achieve that through a lot of hard work, protocols, our practices as well. And there's luck. There's been some luck involved because we had plenty of near misses. Even in when the first outbreak occurred, my recollection is we had that Ruby Princess. We had actually someone come off the boat and breach a regulation and come onto the site. And we had to fend them away. And we've had some really close calls with it. But thankfully, as I said, I think because of the hard work and with some luck, so far we've been able to keep it at bay.
Yeah, it is early days and everybody is doing the best they can. Of course, there are factors outside of our control as well. I'm wondering then, when you started, in this process of the pandemic is going to be a real threat, it's going to be a real upsetting factor in business as usual. How did the regulations come from government and from other bodies to Whiddon and how they interpret it? What's the communication like there?
Look, I think that when you look at the first maybe 12 to 18 months of this, government were learning. Obviously, government were evolving practices, evolving strategies, modifying their directions, even at a legal on the legal front with the laws and things. It was all happening on the fly. And I think that's understandable. It's new territory. So, I guess if you look at things like visitations and PPE protocols, there'd be some guidance that would come out. They would probably panel beat that among themselves. There'd be some industry forums at times where they'd ask for feedback from industry. And eventually a decision would be made. Sometimes it took a bit too long to get that decision and you would have to act and just say, well, bugger this, we're going to do something. And then the direction would come out. And then you'd get a direction just saying employees must be wearing XYZ PPE, visitations are limited to this sort of thing, or, you'd get those directions coming out. So it was this policy on the fly, and it probably had to be, given the volatile nature and the unknown. There's so much uncertainty about the virus. That's kind of what we have probably seen for that first 12 to 18 months. And maybe the last sort of 6 months, a lot of those practices then became embedded in what we're doing. However, as we push on, we need to start refining those practices in the new world we're in now as well.
Yeah, so if this policy, it's a constant evolution and there would have been some times there was uncertainty and trying to protect your residents and protect your staff, where were you looking to for guidance on the right step if regulations weren't at the point where you felt like they were enough?
Predominantly, we work with our masters of the Commonwealth Government, so that we're federally funded, federally regulated. So that's usually your first point of call, is working with federal agencies to get support. We also work quite closely with our state health counterparts as well. So in our case, largely New South Wales Health and Queensland Health. So there's some interactions going on there. Then there are other professional advisory groups all over the place, our peaks as well. So you've probably got multiple layers that you can reach out to. And so that's one layer. What I've seen, which has been beautiful, and it's always been a part of the way we do things anyway at Whiddon, is we're part of a number of peer networks, generally informal. So within the team, we have different peer networks. And that was always just a collaborative group of people that work together and meet regularly just to discuss issues to help each other. And that's been something that's been going on for a while. But what's been really nice to see are those peer groups coming together now during COVID and really helping each other, discussing different strategies, discussing different practices and collaborating and just, sharing information. That's been really helpful because there's a lot of idea sharing that was actually operationalised both ways, that we were able to provide others and them to us. And then we look to ourselves. There were times where we just weren't happy with, the rapid antigen test is a great example of that, because the rapid antigen tests were this emerging technology, I guess, that could be deployed and used in the fight against COVID, or at least a really valuable tool to use in screening among a suite of other things. There was no discussion about it in aged care. It wasn't available. No one was really talking about it. We found suppliers, we found experts in the field, we did it ourselves, and we went to government and said, would you back us in a trial, which they agreed to. And that was a really nice example of how we were able to bring an innovation ourselves to the table that then from our trial, we saw the Department of Health then go conduct the trial with maybe over a dozen providers and then start distributing the rapid antigen tests at no cost to providers in the sector out of a government stockpile. That was a really good example of how we brought something to the table as well.
Cool. Yeah, it's a nice give and take. I think if I was in that position, partly I would feel like it's great that there is openness to communication and that you can bring ideas, but I would also feel like my responsibility is to care for my residents and my staff. Why does it need to come from me and from my team to do something for the better of everybody else? Why is there not the leadership at the top to bring this in?
Yeah, look, I think it's fair to say, we have state and federal governments and regulators who are very well resourced around us. And there's an expectation that they're going to deliver on a number of fronts and they're really going to support us to a certain standard and a certain level. I think that's a fair expectation. I don't think it's unreasonable for providers to be able to innovate and to bring things to the table as well, because I said we have different insights, we have different experiences, lots of different skill sets. And one of the most important areas is just coming from the team on the ground. And I can give you one example where the government had changed visa restrictions at one point. I think it was for students where they had restricted hours they were able to work, and they said sort of, hey, in this pandemic we're going to open that up, and so they can work longer. You can have more access to these clinical staff who are students. They put an expiry date on that, and so 6 months later, I just had one of my managers say to me, if they just got rid of that expiry date, I'd probably have access to another 18 full-time equivalent staff, and that's all they have to do. Yeah. Now, I wouldn't have known that, and so that you could feed that back up to the government, and they actually changed it. We sent them some advice, they changed it, and those little insights that you get make a big difference. So, yeah, that was really valuable.
No, that's a great example. Well, you mentioned before the peer community where you guys are exchanging ideas. I'm guessing this is probably across providers. Can you give us some specific examples of things that you're talking about, issues that have been brought up?
So when I talk about those peer communities, just to give you an idea, so I'm part of it's an informal CEO network with up to 10 CEOs, and we catch up. My COO, she's part of a network like that, and so on. You might have a HR network and a technology network, and in our examples, they're informal. We might catch up once monthly. So through those sort of meetings and sessions, we might have been talking. I mean, the rapid antigen test is a great example of, because we started it, we had a lot of people then in my network asking me, how's it working? What's the cost? What do you need operationally, procedurally? So we shared a lot of information. We ended up eventually doing a paper because we were part of a trial, and we shared that with them. So rapid antigen test was probably a good example, but you may discuss PPE and what is the best, in terms of staff. How do you get the balance right between protection, but also ensuring that we're not cutting ourselves off from our residents from a wellbeing perspective. There are lots of discussions about that. Workforce strategies, what are we doing to support our workforce, retention payments. There's lots of different discussions that are going on, and we're probably meeting every month. So as the environment is changing around us, someone else would come to the table and say, well, look at this new direction we've got. How are you adapting that? And outside of that, I think you've got the professional discussions that are going on about strategies, about procedures and things like that. But for each of those peer networks, those groups of people, just like the frontline employees, are under a lot of pressure, a lot of decision-making, a lot of responsibility. So just being able to check in on each other, share experiences. I'm not alone in this. So from a wellbeing support perspective, I think it was valuable as well, and it still is.
This episode is sponsored by Ending Loneliness Together.
I just felt a sadness inside. I've never spoken to anyone about feeling lonely. I've never spoken to my family. I think I always try to show I'm well, especially to the kids. They'd never imagine that I felt lonely.
Over 5 million Australians are lonely. While we all feel lonely from time to time, longer periods of loneliness are damaging to our health and well-being. Ending Loneliness Together is a national Australian charity with the vision to halve chronic loneliness by 2030. We all have a role to play in ending loneliness. Consider making a donation, becoming a member, or sharing your story with others. Go to www.endingloneliness.com.au for more information.
Now, recently you put out a paper online about the lack of an integrated approach in dealing with COVID. Can you give us a bit of an overview of the paper and maybe what are some of the challenges that you've exposed throughout the process?
Yeah, as Freedom Day really was approaching, so in New South Wales and in Sydney, we'd been in lockdown for 3 months and we started to approach this Freedom Day and people started talking about Freedom Day. And that's where the restrictions were going to be dropped and or reduced. And we were very supportive of that. It was time. What's happening is while the community is starting to free up and while the community is starting to enjoy some new freedoms, there still remains a lot of risk, even in a double vaxxed sort of society, to residents. Residents are still really vulnerable. We haven't had booster shots for residents and residents were among the first to receive the vaccine, many months ago now.
Yeah.
So we're really concerned about the level of exposure as visitors come in, employees, all of that sort of thing. So with that concern and that risk starting to bubble around, what surprised me was that, particularly during that 3-month lockdown, we learnt a lot from the first 18 months. Why wasn't the health ecosystem coming together, federal, state, regulators, learning from what we had done in the past and saying we can do a better job because we certainly can. And as I said earlier, I can accept the journey we've been on and the mistakes made through that evolutionary process. But I think now we've had plenty of time to bring and integrate our strategies and start functioning as one force to fight this battle rather than fighting this battle, through silos. And that's essentially what we have. We have the federal government, we have the state government, we have providers. And then within each of those silos, there are different layers. Federal government has Department of Health and the Quality Commission. State health has got LHDs and the various bodies in there. And still to this day, we're still operating in silos. And to me, it's insane. I totally appreciate that there's, legal ramifications, there's red tape. But if this isn't a time to bring all these groups together and fight the one fire on the one front, I don't know, what is.
That's great. Can you maybe elaborate on the silos? And is it that there's things are being doubled up on? Is it there's conflicting advice, or is it a lack of communication between the different elements?
It's probably all of the above. I think that when I draw on some of these experiences that we've had in the past, I think that if we can get everyone together, if we can get state and federal agencies and regulators together and simply decide on protocols in terms of who's managing what, who's taking charge of what front, on what strategy, on what direction, that in itself would be great. So, for example, if there's an outbreak or if we've got areas of concern where we're heating up procedures and protocols, you don't want to be receiving directions from the Department of Health, and then you don't want to be receiving additional directions from State Health, and then the LHD giving you other directions. You'd much rather, if you have an outbreak, you're working exclusively with, say, State Health, Quality Commission and the Department of Health back off to a certain extent so you can manage that situation. And you can't have 2 or 3 masters trying to give this one entity direction. I think that there's some really simple things that I think need to be addressed that aren't being discussed. When I think of some of the regional locations that we're in, those communities are at risk. Resources are scarce in those communities. You might have populations of, say, 4, 5, 10,000 people even. You've got an aged care provider and you've got a hospital, and you're the 2 largest employers. You both have assets and resources that can be shared. You both have laundries and kitchens. You both have skilled staff, registered nurses there. If one or the other is in trouble, you should have a memorandum of understanding. You should have a combined strategy to work together so that you understand exactly what each party is going to do. What we find ourselves happening is that there are shortages of staff. There's no communication really about, if your kitchen, if you had an outbreak and you couldn't use your kitchen, well, we'll use ours, and here's how it'll work, and here are the logistics around there. This sort of forward planning, which kind of seems very simple, it's just not occurring in those situations. So I think that this sort of collaborative strategies at a local level, they need to be endorsed by the higher powers. So you need endorsement from above. And you need to put a blanket approach across the whole of your jurisdiction. If you look at New South Wales, for example, that we operate in, there might be, I don't know, 8 to 10 different LHDs that we're operating in, and there are inconsistencies across each LHD. Each local health district has a different approach, or you get mixed messaging despite the directions that are coming back from state health or the Department of Health. So we can't afford any more, really. I mean, we couldn't afford it previously, but as you go forward, you need to have all these things ironed out. There's been plenty of opportunities. And that was really, I was calling out in this paper that to really come together and have a unified, integrated strategy across federal and state health, working with providers to fight this fight going forward. It just doesn't make sense that we're not having those conversations now.
Yeah, it sounds like we're still in crisis mode, and it's still a scramble to get whatever done that we can as quickly as we can without a thought for the efficiency. Looking to the future now and past Freedom Day, it strikes me as it's not really Freedom Day for a good portion of the society, and especially for our industry. Not much is going to change immediately, is it?
Look, I mean, not drastically. If you look at visitations, for example, we've opened up visitations, but there's still some restrictions around that. You need to be tight on PPE, on your screening protocols, on clinical and infection control practices. This isn't going away anytime soon. I mean, that applies to a supermarket now, let alone in a very vulnerable aged care home. So having gone out to our home this week, we made the decision with our employees, at least in the initial weeks of Freedom Day, we are in really heavy PPE. We've really equipped them quite heavily in PPE with screens, with P2 masks. So we've gone over and above what's required because we're just concerned about this initial risk, and we're going to monitor it. So it's not going away for aged care. I'm really concerned about the regions in terms of the resources out there, in terms of being able to, service the community, not just aged care, but if we have an outbreak and aged care is relying on the local hospital, which is typically small, that really concerns me as well. So I think that, again, state, federal governments, we really need to have a focus area in these regional communities to make sure we're doing everything we can to prepare. And sometimes, look, I'm not a preacher of doom. Sometimes I hear myself and I think, it's not about a preacher being, sort of looking at it through, in this sort of dark frame or dark lens. But when you're responsible, which is what I am, the buck stops with me, for, over 2,000 people, whether we're caring for them in our homes or at home, and nearly 3,000 employees. And I look at the regional communities, some really vulnerable places like Burke and Walgett and Weewar, which are really vulnerable communities in terms of the resources and the assets they have out there to support them. I will always take a very risk-heavy approach to protecting those people. So just put it out there. That's really the angle that I'm coming from. But yeah, we have a lot more to do. We've got to be cautious. We've got to take steps. I think the other piece that needs to be called out, which has always been there, is well-being of residents and well-being of employees. And having walked around our home and gone and visit some of my friends, some of the residents that I know there quite well this week, it's so disengaging having a P2 mask on, and I wear glasses, and then I've got the screen over me, the face shield over me as well. It's very disengaging. And someone who I know, a couple of people I know really well, they said, who is that? Who is that? And I had to say to Chris, and it's very hard, but I guess we've kept them safe, and we're just trying to get this very delicate balance right. So I think that if community transmission, as we see community transitions start to decline, as we see a positive impact from double vaccination in the community, then I'm hoping we can slowly step the levels of normality up in the aged care setting. But we have to be cautious, and it will take a bit more time.
Yeah, absolutely. And Thank you for outlining that balance. I've often wondered about that you do need to preserve well-being and make it a life worth living wherever the person is.
Oh, yeah.
But you need to keep people safe as well. How have you guys approached keeping people connected within communities and keeping life entertaining within a home?
Yeah, look, it's not been easy. I mean, I remember in that first wave, we called them risk-free visits and a lot of providers started doing this where you were using, windows and glass barriers and things like that to facilitate the families coming in and visiting and all that sort of stuff. We brought in some technology, so we were part of a development of an app that needs support. So, residents still need support. They'll need a person to help them launch it in many cases and things like that. But the app provided that sort of Skype, FaceTime sort of functionality so families could connect while they were locked out. We sort of supported a lot of different communication practices between families and residents as well. So I guess you're doing as much as you can, but the reality is, and I need to call this out, it's not perfect. I don't think that... I would have liked to do a lot more. I would have liked to have seen a lot more happen. I'm sure a lot of other providers would have liked to do that as well. The two things you have to factor in, or maybe three things, is that, one, borders shut, so we lost access to staff. We started seeing workforce furloughing, staff having to go into self-quarantine and self-isolation because of exposure. And we saw sick leave and attendance go down, sick leave increase, because there was apprehension. People had families at home. I can't blame employees for that. So rosters were really under a lot of pressure. And on top of it, you had all these sort of operational challenges. So people had to work harder, were doing other jobs, screening and things like that. So the workforce was really under pressure. And when they're under pressure, things like activities and those sorts of areas, the reality is you probably can't give them the focus that you want. And from a Whiddon perspective, we pioneered things like relationship-based care, a whole stack of different programs. We revitalised our model of care. It's the reason that we exist. It's what we wake up for every day. This has been really hard because it's very hard you push your people that hard to say, we need to do more on the wellbeing front, we need to do more activities when they're already short-staffed and under pressure. So we tried to get the balance as well as we could. We couldn't bring volunteers in to help either. So it's a challenging situation. Anyone tells you they came up with a perfect solution is kidding themselves. If we had access to more workers, if the volunteers could have come in and we had the borders open, it probably would have helped. I can't believe when I look back, we still managed we launched a cooking program with residents during that period as one example. We ran a couple of other programs as well. We still managed to have a lot of celebrations for different events that occurred during the time, but obviously it was a condensed version of what we normally would have done. So yeah, putting that well-being of employees and residents at the forefront has always been important, but very challenging during this time as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris, we're almost out of time. I wanted to ask you, going forward for the next 6 months, what are you and the leadership team looking towards? What's on the horizon, do you think?
Well, interestingly enough, and probably not dissimilar to that conversation we just had about well-being, I really want to see us get back to some level of normality in terms of our strategy and our directions as an organisation. So as I said, we're a not-for-profit organisation. We exist for two reasons: our employees, our people, and the people we care for. That's why we exist. And in this survival mode over the last sort of period of time, couple of years really, we haven't been able to really engage as heavily in some of those directions that we had on the cards. We had a number of care programs, different care programs, innovation that we've been working on. We've got new developments that we're working on as well. So we've got a host of employee-centric programs as well. A lot of this stuff has kind of had to take a back seat because of the crisis management. So what we are trying to do is, as best we can, operationalise the COVID management, the COVID strategies, operationalise that while ensuring that we're doing our very best to minimise risk. But at the same time, we're trying to breathe life back into our purpose, breathe life back into our strategies and get those things back on the table. And if a quarter of our time has been spent on that in the past 2 years, because 75% has been on crisis management, I'd like to see that become 50, 60, 70, 80% as we go forward, because that's why we exist. Obviously, we're dependent on what happens with COVID. Are there new strains? What happens with community transmission? How well do we manage it? How well is it managed around us? But also, I think that if we're serious about the people we care for and the people providing that care, those people around us, that health ecosystem has to come together now and do a much better job going forward. We can excuse, as I said before, we understand what's happened in the past. We need them to come together to a much better degree to support the industry as a whole and our residents and people going forward. So I think that we are dependent to some extent, but Whiddon will always do our best to control our own destiny as well. And we need to come back to some of those key strategic directions now going forward to benefit those key stakeholders, our people and our residents.
Yeah, fantastic. Chris, thank you so much for your time today. Where can people find out more about what we've been talking about and the report that you released recently?
Yeah, so the report itself, I've posted that on my LinkedIn. You can just look up Chris Mamarelis on LinkedIn and you'll find that and a lot of other stuff on Whiddon. There's also a lot of information on our website, whiddon.com.au. You'll be able to find some information there, and any sort of searches should be able to take you to Whiddon. And I believe that there's a lot of work going on in the background. Let's just keep our fingers crossed that it doesn't take months. Over the coming weeks, we see some action and we get some positive results for the benefit of the whole industry.
Yeah, fantastic. Chris, thanks for your time today.
Yeah, pleasure, Ash. Thank you.
Well, we hope you enjoyed this episode of the Aged Care Enrichment Podcast, brought to you by Silver Adventures. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening. And if you're enjoying it, please leave us a review. We'd really appreciate it. If you're interested in finding out how immersive virtual reality experiences can enrich the lives of older adults, visit the Silver Adventures website today at www.silver, that's SILVR, adventures.com.au. See you next week.